Okay, let's go to New York. I want to introduce you to Tim Seymour. He is the CIO of Seymour Asset Management. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Dana, how are you? Good to be here
Great.
today.
Thanks for doing this. Tim and I know each other from Moscow because I was a correspondent there, and Tim was in asset management at another company there. And so you have gone from, very broad asset expertise, and you have really specialized into cannabis. Tell me why
Yeah.
you made that transition.
Well, it's interesting because, I would make an argument that a lot of parallels that I saw of being in Russia in the late 90s and being an emerging markets investor for the next 15 years are some of the same attributes that are akin to investing in cannabis. I mean, this is a new asset class. This is an emerging market. And yet what drove a lot of the investor interest in big emerging markets was this new frontier, but it was around demographics, consumption trends, and I think a rapidly evolving investment dynamic. And the same thing is happening in cannabis. And the obvious macro part of the trade is the legislation and the changes that we're seeing, and we're seeing them around the world. And obviously, Canada's legalization north of the border here was a very big moment for the industry overall. But to that extent, to answer your question, as an investor, finding opportunities where you see enormous growth, where there are, I think, significant risks and some of the depth of the markets and some of the inefficiency of the information flow, to me as an investor, is an incredibly interesting place to invest.
Enormous growth. And it's interesting because I'm Canadian, so I know kind of, the 2-year debate, and then finally Canada was the tip of the spear in the legalization of cannabis. And a lot of states in the US were saying, no way, you're not going to see it here, except in maybe, California and some of the other ones that started experimenting with it. And then this election is seismic in terms of the number of states who have now signed up and legalized cannabis, whether it be recreational or whether it only be for the health side.
It's the election was, as you say, seismic. I would characterize it as really Goldilocks for cannabis and for cannabis investors, because perversely, I actually don't think a full federal legalization of cannabis is something that would be good for the industry right now. I don't think it would be good for the development of the infrastructure. I don't think it would be very good for investors, because I still think that there's an enormous amount of regulatory bureaucracy meets overlap of 6 different federal agencies that I think would be falling all over themselves. But what's been proven is that on a state by state basis, and letting states' rights and letting the states act, and this goes all the way back to effectively the Cole memo under the Obama administration, which set the table for a lot of this, which is let the states do what they want to do in cannabis without fear of federal intervention. And that's largely gone on. And so if you look at
it's complicated, right? Because a lot of people don't understand that the states are legalizing it, but the federal government is still saying no. And then, I talked to somebody who runs a company in the US in cannabis, and they said it's very upside down, because, for instance, if you want to nationalize your company, or you want to move cannabis from one state to another, or you want to move assets from the sale or proceeds of sale or health products, you can find yourself technically breaking the law with the federal government.
Yeah, and I think some of the legacy laws that go back in alcohol to prohibition have a lot to do with some of the things that cannabis is enduring. But yes, that's right. I think the capital markets and the banking dynamics in practical terms also are the most onerous and punitive in terms of the cost of capital, but also how difficult it is for these companies to actually do traditional banking. Going over state lines is I think we're even, at some point with a federal backdrop, I think that's still going to be a ways to go. But I think the tax issues as they relate to the IRS and treating any sales and kind of retail orientation from cannabis as a Schedule I drug is maybe the most debilitating, punitive, whatever you want to say about operating in the United States. But I will say that on a state level, the companies that are vertically integrated, so that means that they're seed to sale, right? And they're growing the plant, they're packaging the plant, they're taking it all the way through to a retail channel. Um, it are very profitable, very, very profitable, especially those companies that are operating in the States that have what we call limited license dynamics to them, which just simply means that there's only so many licenses that they handed out, and those
Tim,
companies actually
how
are very
profitable
profitable.
is all this stuff? I mean, you're talking about some companies that are up 24%, another company's up 75%. So far this month after the legalization and the vote, I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, this is big stuff, right?
Well, in terms of market cap, you're right. And we're getting into the performance of the cannabis stocks. I run a cannabis ETF, the ticker CNBS, and it's an active strategy because I think this is exactly what you need at this time. But what's interesting is that the movement in a lot of the cannabis stocks going into the elections was really on the back of their own profitability. So what we're talking about, not necessarily the fact that you had a very big states follow through. Remember, in the elections, again, we won't go back into that part of the conversation. I'll just simply say New Jersey, Montana, Mississippi, South Dakota, Arizona all turned on the cannabis green light. And so what that meant for a lot of the companies, though, that either were already set up in New Jersey, for example, which is, as you can imagine, going to be one of the biggest markets in the country. This was a boom. But the more important part of it is, despite what appeared to be growth at all costs in a lot of companies that really weren't well run and weren't really making any money, especially those, sorry to say, north of the border. It's not to indict Canada. It's truly to say, though, that look, the United States is the biggest market in the world for a lot of consumer products, and it is certainly in cannabis. And the companies that are set up with good assets here are phenomenally profitable. And the move in the stocks this year, especially off the lows from kind of the COVID lows, is more about profitability and companies that are actually well run. And in fact, they're probably in their third generation of management teams at this point. So it's an exciting time in the sector.
I was going to ask you, I mean, who are these guys and how sophisticated? But you're saying a lot of the maybe newcomers have been thinned out, and these are sophisticated companies that, and some of the bigger fish are eating the little ones.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of consolidation at this point. But if I took the top 5 operators in the United States, and they would be Curaleaf, which is actually run by a gentleman we might have run into in Moscow, Boris Jordan, who started this company. Trueleaf, he's built a great business, and Trueleaf, which is a single state operator, and really I need to actually restate that they're in multiple states, but they're known for their dominance in Florida, and they're trying to grow outside of that market. GTI, which is Midwest based, but has very important assets on the East Coast and then in Illinois and some of the Midwest. Cresco Labs, also Chicago based, but very well situated in important states, and a company called Trueleaf, which is mostly Pennsylvania and now New Jersey. And because of the profitability in those states are 2 of the best in the country, that company has been that company's up 350% this year. So there's your top 5. And really, in all of these cases, there's new management teams in place, and in many cases, CEOs that were formerly CPG titans, guys that really knew how to build a business that was focused on a consumer brand, not necessarily the cultivation side of it. This isn't a commodity story. It's not an ag story. It's ultimately going to be a very sophisticated brand story. And I think those companies that have elevated themselves here are not only very well run companies, but have begun to build on that branding.
Okay, 2 quick questions. State governments, I mean, I don't want to be melodramatic, but is this the life ring that they need, struggling with budget shortfalls and a lot of them are, I wouldn't want to say bankrupt, but I mean, they're teetering that way with what's happened in the COVID-19 economy.
Yeah, look, let's be clear. This is a very difficult time on the fiscal side in state and then the underlying municipalities in many, many parts of the country. So what's cannabis mean, and what has this meant for support for cannabis legislation? Obviously, cannabis is a source of budgetary revenue that is exciting for a lot of the states. Washington State which is one of the most call it well founded markets. It's one of the oldest markets. It's one of the most sophisticated markets. Announced today that they've raised $1 billion in revenues from cannabis taxes since the inception of the market. And again, Washington was one of the first, but half of that
is that over a couple of years, Tim?
Yeah, that's over probably about 7 years.
Okay.
And let's be clear, we're talking about Washington, and with all due respect to our friends in the Northwest, it's not the biggest market in the world, right? So if you think about cannabis revenues overall in 2019, the latest numbers are about $1.9 billion was collected in terms of excise and taxes on the state's levels. And as you can imagine, California, which is the biggest cannabis market in the world, much in the way that we know it's one of the largest economies in the world on its own, was about a third of those revenues, about $650 million in California, which has been much maligned and much criticized, probably accurately, in terms of some of their regulation. But leaving that aside, you asked about the impact of cannabis revenues, and there's no question that this is an exciting thing for the states and has a lot to do with the legalizations we're seeing and a change in public perception. And this obviously then goes straight through to Washington, where you can imagine that especially on the Republican senatorial side, where we've had the most obstinance, you're going to see a change, and you're going to see this vote in favor of federal. And when that happens, I don't know. Last week was a very important week, both from a momentous in terms of the headline, which is that the House voted to legalize cannabis. Right now, that's dead on arrival in this Senate, but it tells you at least where this conversation is going, and it's going not only because I think a lot of people believe socially it's the right thing to do, and it's the right assessment of a drug that's not a gateway drug and is proven to be.
You're preempting my second question, which was,
change
the perception. No, thank you for doing that. It saves time, but change the perception on the government side, change the perception on the public side is because, continue on, please.
Because, look, I think there's a lot of reasons why cannabis was made illegal, and we call it marijuana, which, I'm doing my best to never refer to the term. I think it's a prohibition term. I think it's a term that actually was actually targeted to on some of the criminal justice side against minorities. And I think the social conscience of this industry is high. And I no pun intended, I do think that there's a dynamic where there's a better understanding of where people are medicating themselves across a lot of different products, and some are alcohol and OTC products, and some of them are the more complex and the more devastating opioid crisis in the United States, and the understanding where cannabis, both from a full spectrum of use cases, but certainly a lot of the OTC use cases, and then straight through to some of the use cases as it relates to pain management and whatnot. There's no question about the efficacy. There's better understanding, but it's clear more research needs to be done, and this is part of where the legislation needs to allow research on the plant. And it's an incredibly complex plant. And to be clear, I think the cannabis industry is out there saying this isn't about access of cannabis to minors. And in fact, some of the tax money in Washington that I talked about is going just towards those programs that keeps cannabis out of the hands of minors. It's an important issue. It's important to be regulated. It's important, like any product, to bring the consistency, the safety that comes with regulation. And I think that's part of the understanding in cannabis. Then there are the dynamics around criminal justice and awareness of where clearly this has been an unfair legal environment as it relates to cannabis and incarceration against minorities.
The U.S. certainly has a lot of trouble with when you take a look at the numbers of people incarcerated for pretty minor possession charges. And it's interesting though that you talked about kids, right? I mean, in the Canadian experience, that they talked about one of the reasons to legalize is to move it away from schools and get rid of the black market, make it safer. And then a recent statistic said 40% of the cannabis market share in Canada is still held by illegal producers. So it doesn't exactly shake all that out.
No, it doesn't. And I think the black market, the gray market will continue to at least be a dynamic. And look, if you're changing perception, the people that at one point would have had a big problem with that the illegal head shop down the road was selling cannabis in through the back door, when it's generally legal on the state level and 70% of the country believes it should be legal, the gray market, the black market actually gets a benefit here, right? A lot of people just don't care that it's going on, in their neighborhood, or they may not seek to bring in enforcement again. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think it's all about. And I remember when I was 12, my grandfather used to say to me, you should legalize cannabis to get the mob out of it. And he was probably saying marijuana, by the way.
He was a forward-thinking guy.
His point was simply that it's there, it's out there, people are consuming it, people want it, and so why not tax it? Why not regulate it? Why not make it safe? And I think that's what's going on.
Anyway, huge growth to come. Tim Seymour of Seymour Asset Management. Tim, great to talk to you.
Dana, great to be here.